run from the decade, and the picture looks almost impossibly tidy. A smiling mother in a clean apron waits at the door. A father in a pressed suit hangs his hat exactly where it belongs. The children argue only about which chores to do first, and every disagreement resolves itself neatly within 22 minutes, right before the credits roll. This image, broadcast into millions of American living rooms, became the template an entire country measured itself against. But behind a genuinely enormous number of those same front doors, a very different, far less tidy reality was unfolding. One involving medicated housewives, hidden domestic violence with no legal recourse, closeted identities, and a legal and medical system that actively prevented most of it from ever becoming visible. Understanding exactly what was happening, and precisely which laws, diagnoses, and social structures eventually changed to expose and address it, tells a genuinely important story about the real cost of that carefully maintained public image. A woman trapped in an unhappy or abusive marriage had essentially no legal path to leave without her husband's consent or proof of specific fault. Throughout the 1950s, every American state required a divorcing spouse to prove legal fault, adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty in front of a judge before a divorce could be granted. A legal standard that made simply wanting to leave an unhappy marriage without evidence of a specific legally recognized offense essentially impossible to act on. This meant a woman in a genuinely miserable or even dangerous marriage frequently had no realistic legal exit unless she could produce documented proof of a qualifying offense, a considerably higher bar than the marriage's actual unhappiness, and one that often required humiliating public testimony even when it could be met at all. This changed specifically when California passed the nation's first no-fault divorce law in 1969, signed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan, allowing a marriage to be dissolved simply on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, without requiring either spouse to prove wrongdoing. Every other state gradually adopted some version of no-fault divorce over the following decades, with New York becoming the final state to do so only in 2010, meaning the specific legal barrier trapping unhappy 1950s marriages in place persisted in at least one state for over 4 additional decades after California's original reform.
A husband could not be prosecuted for sexually assaulting his own wife anywhere in the country, a legal gap rooted in centuries-old law that left this specific form of abuse entirely outside the reach of the legal system. Marital rape exemption laws existed in every state throughout the decade, treating marriage itself as constituting permanent legal consent, meaning a wife experiencing this specific form of abuse had no criminal legal recourse whatsoever, regardless of how the assault actually occurred. This exemption began eroding only in 1975, when South Dakota became the first state to fully criminalize marital rape, with the process of eliminating the exemption nationwide not completing until 1993. Decades after the decade being discussed had already ended. A documented legal timeline showing this specific gap in protection persisted considerably longer than most people realize.
Widespread prescription of tranquilizers to housewives became so common by the end of the decade and into the following one that the phenomenon earned its own cultural nickname, reflecting a documented medical response to distress that was rarely addressed through any other means. The tranquilizer meprobamate, marketed under brand names including Milltown, was introduced in 1955 and rapidly became one of the best-selling prescription drugs in American history within just a few years. prescribed overwhelmingly to women experiencing what doctors at the time vaguely termed nervous tension or housewife's fatigue, symptoms that later analysis increasingly recognized as documented responses to genuine social isolation, unaddressed depression, and the specific pressures of an idealized domestic role that left little room for a woman's individual distress to be acknowledged as legitimate on its own terms. Later in the following decade, Valium became so widely prescribed to women specifically that it earned the popular nickname Mother's Little Helper, a documented cultural shorthand for exactly this pattern of medicating widespread unaddressed distress rather than examining its actual social causes. Author Betty Friedan's 1963 book directly investigated this same widespread but largely unnamed distress among housewives of the era, conducting original survey research among women who had graduated from elite women's colleges and documenting a pattern she termed the problem that has no name, a pervasive, unspoken dissatisfaction that the idealized domestic role of the period offered no legitimate outlet or vocabulary for expressing. This research is widely credited by historians with helping catalyze the broader women's rights movement of the following decade, a direct, traceable link between documented mid-century domestic distress and the subsequent legal and social changes that followed it. Homosexuality was formally classified as a mental illness throughout the entire decade, a medical designation that carried severe, documented legal and social consequences for anyone identified as gay or lesbian. The American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual classified homosexuality as a mental disorder throughout the 1950s, a formal medical designation that supported widespread, entirely legal discrimination, including employment termination, institutionalization, and in some documented cases, involuntary psychiatric treatment intended to change a person's sexual orientation. Federal policy compounded this further, with a 1953 executive order explicitly barring gay and lesbian individuals from federal employment, a policy historians now commonly refer to as the Lavender Scare, running parallel to the same era's broader anti-communist political investigations. This classification was not removed from psychiatric diagnostic standards until 1973, when the American Psychiatric Association's board voted to remove homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders, a decision driven by mounting research and direct advocacy contesting the scientific validity of the original classification. This meant that for the entire 1950s and well into the following 2 decades, a gay or lesbian person living during the supposedly idyllic family era faced an active medical, legal, and employment framework specifically designed to treat their identity as a disorder requiring correction, a reality entirely invisible within the decade's public, idealized family imagery. Unmarried pregnant women, particularly teenagers, were frequently sent away to maternity homes, specifically to hide the pregnancy from their communities, with the resulting infant surrendered for adoption under considerable, often coercive, pressure. An unmarried pregnant woman in the 1950s faced such severe social stigma that families commonly sent daughters away, often described publicly as visiting a relative, to maternity homes specifically designed to conceal the pregnancy from friends, neighbors, and often extended family, with adoption arranged immediately after birth, frequently without the mother given any meaningful choice in the matter. Historical research and first-hand accounts collected in subsequent decades, including through formal government inquiries in several countries examining similar historical maternity home practices, have documented that consent for these adoptions was often obtained under considerable emotional pressure, incomplete information, or, in some well-documented cases, no genuine informed consent process at all. This practice declined substantially through the following decades due to several converging factors, including the Supreme Court's 1973 ruling establishing constitutional protection for abortion access, considerably reduced social stigma surrounding unmarried motherhood following the broader social changes of the 1960s and 1970s, and the gradual introduction of more comprehensive sex education and contraception access following the Food and Drug Administration's 1960 approval of the first oral contraceptive pill. A documented medical and legal timeline showing this specific hidden practice was shaped directly by the absence of reproductive options that did not yet exist during the decade in question.
Domestic violence carried no meaningful legal protection framework, with police departments throughout the decade treating reported abuse as a private family matter rather than a criminal offense warranting intervention. Police response to reported domestic violence throughout the 1950s was documented in historical law enforcement training materials and contemporary sociological research as generally favoring mediation or simply leaving the residence rather than treating the incident as a criminal matter, reflecting a broader legal and cultural framework that treated a marriage's internal conflicts as fundamentally outside appropriate government intervention. No dedicated domestic violence shelters existed anywhere in the United States during this decade, and protective order laws allowing a victim to obtain a legally enforceable restraining order against an abusive spouse did not begin appearing in state law until the 1970s, with Pennsylvania passing one of the first comprehensive statutes in 1976. The first documented American domestic violence shelter did not open until 1974 in St. Paul, Minnesota, meaning a woman experiencing abuse throughout the entire 1950s had access to no dedicated support infrastructure of the kind that exists in some form across nearly every American community today. A documented, traceable absence of both legal remedy and physical safe haven that the idealized family imagery of the decade never had to account for. Corporal punishment of children within the home was universally legal and culturally expected throughout the decade, with almost no external mechanism for identifying or intervening in cases that crossed into what would now be classified as abuse. Physical discipline of children was not only legal, but actively recommended in mainstream parenting guidance throughout the 1950s, with no mandatory reporting system requiring doctors, teachers, or neighbors to report suspected child abuse to any authority. The first state mandatory child abuse reporting law was not passed until 1963 in California, following the influential publication of a 1962 medical journal article formally identifying and naming what researchers termed battered child syndrome. The first serious clinical medical documentation establishing child abuse as a recognizable, diagnosable medical and social problem, rather than simply a private family matter beyond outside scrutiny. This 1962 research directly catalyzed a rapid wave of state legislation, with all 50 states adopting some form of mandatory child abuse reporting law by 1967. A remarkably fast legislative response once the underlying medical research existed, but one that arrived only after the entire 1950s had already passed without any formal mechanism for identifying or intervening in cases of genuine child abuse occurring behind the same tidy front doors depicted in the decade's popular entertainment. Alcoholism within the household frequently went entirely unaddressed, with no widely available treatment framework and considerable social pressure to simply conceal the problem rather than seek help. Alcohol dependency throughout the 1950s was broadly treated as a private moral failing rather than a medical condition. despite the American Medical Association having formally classified alcoholism as a disease as early as 1956, a classification that took considerable additional time to meaningfully reshape actual treatment access and public attitudes.
Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935, existed throughout the decade, but reached only a modest fraction of those affected, and formal insurance coverage for addiction treatment remained essentially non-existent until considerably later legislative action, including provisions within the Mental Health Parity Act of 1996 and its subsequent 2008 expansion, which required insurance plans to cover addiction and mental health treatment comparably to physical health conditions. This meant a household managing a parent's untreated alcoholism throughout the 1950s had access to considerably less structured medical or insurance support than exists today, a documented gap in both medical classification enforcement and insurance policy that left many families managing this specific hidden struggle with minimal outside institutional support, entirely apart from the decade's public image of composed, orderly domestic life. Women faced no legal protection against employment termination for pregnancy, and the broader financial dependency this created left many trapped within unhappy or difficult marriages for entirely economic reasons. Throughout the 1950s, an employer could legally terminate a woman for becoming pregnant, and combined with the already discussed difficulty married women faced obtaining independent credit or loans without a husband's co-signature, this created a documented structural financial dependency that made leaving a marriage, even a genuinely difficult one, an economically perilous decision for a great many women, regardless of the marriage's actual quality.
Pregnancy employment discrimination was not federally prohibited until the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, and the broader credit independence already discussed did not arrive until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, meaning the entire decade in question operated within a financial and legal structure that made economic independence from an unhappy marriage considerably harder to achieve than the decade's cheerful public family imagery ever depicted. Involuntary psychiatric commitment required remarkably little legal justification throughout the decade, and the surgical lobotomy remained an accepted treatment for a wide range of conditions, including ordinary emotional distress and social nonconformity. Throughout the 1950s, a spouse, parent, or even a concerned neighbor could initiate involuntary psychiatric commitment proceedings against a family member with minimal legal due process, often requiring only a single physician's signature rather than the considerably more rigorous judicial review process required today. Once institutionalized, patients faced an array of treatments that would now be considered ethically unacceptable, including the prefrontal lobotomy, a surgical procedure severing connections within the brain's frontal lobe, performed on an estimated tens of thousands of American patients throughout the decade and the years immediately preceding it, frequently for conditions including depression, anxiety, and even documented cases involving women whose primary diagnosed complaint was simply defying expected domestic behavior. The lobotomy's use declined sharply beginning in the mid-1950s, specifically due to the introduction of the antipsychotic medication chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, which offered a considerably less invasive pharmaceutical alternative for managing severe psychiatric symptoms. Legal reform governing involuntary commitment proceeded considerably more slowly, with the Supreme Court's 1975 ruling in O'Connor versus
Donaldson establishing that a person could not be involuntarily confined without evidence of genuine danger to themselves or others, a constitutional due process standard that did not exist in any comparable form throughout the 1950s, when involuntary commitment proceedings faced nowhere near this level of legal scrutiny. The tightly controlled media image of the ideal American family was itself an actively managed commercial and political product, shaped deliberately by television networks, advertisers, and government messaging, rather than simply an accurate reflection of how most households actually lived. Television programming throughout the decade operated under considerable direct oversight from corporate sponsors and network standards departments, which actively vetted scripts to remove content depicting marital conflict, financial hardship, or any storyline suggesting the nuclear family model was anything other than uniformly successful and fulfilling. Historical research into the production process behind the decade's most iconic family programming has documented specific instances where writers were directed to soften or remove plot lines depicting genuine domestic tension, reflecting sponsors' explicit commercial interest in associating their products with an aspirational, conflict-free version of family life, rather than any accurate documentary representation of it. This commercial incentive dovetailed with a broader Cold War political context in which the idealized, prosperous nuclear family was actively promoted, including through government-sponsored exhibitions and messaging, as a deliberate visual argument for the superiority of American capitalism over Soviet communism. A documented propaganda function historians have specifically analyzed in connection with events including the widely publicized 1959 kitchen exhibition displayed in Moscow.
Understanding this deliberate commercial and political construction helps explain precisely why the decade's dominant family image was so remarkably, consistently tidy, since it was never simply an unfiltered mirror held up to ordinary American households, but a carefully managed product serving specific corporate and governmental interests simultaneously.
Racial segregation excluded a substantial portion of American families entirely from the idealized suburban family image, both in its media representation and in the actual housing and financial policy that determined who could access that lifestyle at all. The suburban ideal depicted throughout 1950s media was, with only rare exception, exclusively white, reflecting not simply a narrow creative choice, but the documented, legally enforced housing discrimination already discussed in connection with redlining, which systematically excluded black families from federally backed suburban mortgage lending, regardless of income or creditworthiness. Simultaneously, throughout much of the South, legally enforced segregation under Jim Crow laws meant black families experienced an entirely separate, considerably more constrained set of legal protections, public accommodations, and economic opportunities than the decade's dominant, idealized family imagery ever depicted or acknowledged. This meant the specific version of family life being celebrated and broadcast throughout the decade was never intended, structurally or commercially, to represent the actual diversity of American family experience, but rather a specific, narrow demographic slice, whose access to suburban prosperity was itself actively enabled by the same discriminatory federal housing policy already discussed, a documented historical reality that fundamentally complicates any simple nostalgic reading of the decade's family imagery as broadly representative of the country as a whole.
Children with undiagnosed learning disabilities, developmental differences, or intellectual disabilities frequently faced institutionalization, harsh discipline, or simple exclusion from mainstream family and school life, since almost no diagnostic framework existed to identify or support these conditions. A child throughout the 1950s exhibiting behavior now understood as connected to conditions including autism, ADHD, or dyslexia had access to essentially no formal diagnostic or educational support framework, since these conditions were either entirely unrecognized clinically or, in the case of autism specifically, only just beginning to be described in the psychiatric literature of the period, initially framed through theories now considered scientifically discredited, including the widely publicized but false claim attributing autism to inadequate maternal warmth, a theory that placed unwarranted blame directly on mothers for a condition science had not yet properly understood. Families facing a child with significant developmental or intellectual disabilities were frequently advised by physicians to institutionalize the child permanently, often with the explicit recommendation that the family simply tell neighbors and extended relatives the child had died. A documented historical practice aimed specifically at protecting the family's public image of normalcy rather than supporting the child's actual well-being. This began changing substantially only with the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, which legally guaranteed public education access for children with disabilities, and with the gradual deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 1970s, itself prompted partly by widely publicized investigative journalism exposing severe, documented abuse and neglect inside state institutions. The entire 1950s, in other words, operated without any of the diagnostic understanding or legal protection framework that today allows children with developmental differences to remain within their own families and receive appropriate educational support, rather than facing the institutionalization and enforced secrecy commonly recommended throughout the decade in question. Family businesses and farms throughout the decade commonly relied on child labor that would now violate federal labor protections, treated as an unremarkable extension of family responsibility, rather than a labor practice subject to any meaningful regulatory limit. While the Fair Labor Standards Act had already established basic federal child labor protections by 1938, enforcement throughout the 1950s remained considerably weaker for agricultural work and family-run businesses specifically, both of which received broad exemptions that allowed children, including those well under the minimum age otherwise required for other industries, to work long hours in physically demanding farm labor, or extended shifts within a family retail or service business, often instead of attending school consistently. Documented historical labor statistics from the period show meaningfully higher rates of school absence and early workforce entry among children from farming and small business families compared to later decades, a pattern connected directly to these specific regulatory exemptions, rather than simply reflecting a stronger, unrelated work ethic passed down within those families. Subsequent amendments to federal child labor law throughout the following decades gradually tightened agricultural work exemptions, alongside a broader documented decline in family farming itself, as agricultural consolidation reduced the number of small family farms substantially between the 1950s and the present day, together reducing the prevalence of this particular hidden family labor practice considerably. Though agricultural child labor exemptions notably still remain somewhat broader under federal law today than protections applying to most other industries, a documented regulatory gap that persists in modified form even now. Childbirth throughout the decade commonly involved medical practices that stripped mothers of meaningful choice or consent, reflecting a broader paternalistic medical culture that treated women's own reported experience and preferences as largely irrelevant to their own care. The majority of American births throughout the 1950s took place under a practice commonly called twilight sleep, a combination of morphine and scopolamine administered specifically to induce amnesia during labor, meaning many mothers had no actual memory of giving birth to their own children. A documented medical practice justified at the time as sparing women the pain of childbirth, but one that also conveniently removed any need for a physician to obtain a mother's ongoing, informed consent for whatever procedures took place while she remained conscious, but without memory formation. Fathers were almost universally barred from the delivery room entirely, a hospital policy justified on sanitary grounds that later research found had little genuine medical basis. And standard hospital practice routinely separated newborns from mothers for extended periods immediately after birth, a policy later maternal and infant bonding research would come to view as considerably more harmful than helpful. This began shifting substantially only with the natural childbirth movement gaining mainstream traction through the 1960s and 1970s, informed by published research and advocacy questioning both the medical necessity and the psychological cost of twilight sleep sedation, alongside a broader patients' rights movement that eventually produced formal, informed consent standards now considered a basic, legally required element of any medical procedure. The American Hospital Association did not adopt its first formal Patients' Bill of Rights until 1973, meaning the entire 1950s birth experience operated under a medical consent standard considerably weaker than what exists today. A documented gap between the decade's cheerful imagery of a joyful, cooperative delivery room and the considerably more disempowering reality many mothers actually experienced without full memory or meaningful choice in the matter. Taken together, the gap between the 1950s family's public image and its documented private reality traces to a specific, identifiable set of legal, medical, and institutional absences, rather than simply reflecting harder times people quietly endured with more stoicism than people display today. Each example discussed here connects to a specific, traceable moment when research, legislation, or medical reclassification finally addressed a gap that had persisted for years or decades beforehand. The 1962 Battered Child Syndrome research, the 1969 first no-fault divorce law, the 1973 removal of homosexuality from psychiatric diagnostic manuals, the 1974 shelter movement's earliest beginnings, the 1974 and 1978 employment and credit protections for women, and the marital rape exemption's slow, state-by-state elimination, completing only in 1993. None of these protections existed automatically, and their absence throughout the 1950s was not a minor technicality, but a documented structural reality that left an enormous amount of genuine suffering entirely invisible behind the same doors the era's popular culture depicted as uniformly happy and composed. This is not a case for concluding that no genuine happiness or stability existed within 1950s family life, since plenty of families did experience real warmth, connection, and functional partnership during the decade, exactly as popular memory suggests. But an honest account has to hold both truths simultaneously: the real affection many families genuinely shared, and the documented legal and medical vacuum that left abuse, addiction, discrimination, and genuine personal suffering with remarkably few paths toward acknowledgement, intervention, or escape. The perfectly tidy household glowing on the television screen was never lying about every family. It was simply never built to show the ones for whom the decade's celebrated order was actually concealing something considerably harder underneath it. If your own grandparents or great-grandparents lived through this decade, it is worth remembering that whatever version of their story survived into family memory was very likely the edited one, the version that matched what the era expected a family to look like from the outside. The fuller picture, the one this decade's culture actively worked to keep hidden, usually only comes into view decades later, once the specific laws, diagnoses, and institutions that once enforced that silence have finally changed enough to let people speak about it honestly. A genuinely worthwhile reminder the next time an old photograph or an old rerun makes that decade look effortlessly perfect.